Hi everyone, my name is Allie Davis and today I'm going to be talking about Thetford mines. So before we jump in, I just want to walk you through the table of contents quickly. So first we'll be going through a quick overview which will outline some of the purpose and objectives of exploring this area. We will look at the growth of Thetford mines, the health risks of asbestos exposure, the regulation of asbestos globally, how these mines actually sustain their profitability amid regulations around the world, the economic impact of closures of asbestos mines, and then where asbestos mining and production and exportation stands today. And then we'll talk about some of the key takeaways, and I will also have a reference slide at the back that you are welcome to look through. So, and while we've heard about some of the environmental and health issues that go along with asbestos, it's important to mention that asbestos was really important and used for a variety of reasons at the time, including building and construction, as well as like strengthening cement as plastics, and again, insulation, roofing, fireproofing, and sound absorption. So this was a very popular commodity at the time. And the commodity was important for things beyond the home, such as shipbuilding and to insulate boilers and steam pipes, as well as hot water pipes. So very, very popular and important commodity at the time. So we've read about this, we've learned about this, but it's really important to talk about the actual impact of asbestos. And there's a variety of studies that have been done, but there are estimates that the annual global healthcare costs associated with health effects of asbestos range from about 2.4 to 3.9 billion US dollars. And this excludes any additional costs of pain, suffering, and welfare losses. So it's important to mention that these estimates also do not include costs associated with non-cancerous asbestos-related diseases such as asbestosis. And as you can see here in the chart, asbestosis actually has a very, very, very high standardized mortality rate. And so we can see that this is a real issue that is not usually accounted for when we look at the estimated costs of asbestos. And so while the WHO recommends that the most effective way to eliminate asbestos-related diseases is to ban the use of all forms of asbestos, unfortunately there are about 125 million people in the world who are still exposed to asbestos at the workplace, and unfortunately all forms of asbestos, including crystotile, which is the type that was mined within the Thetford mines, are carcinogenic to humans. So we can see here some of the data. I've highlighted some of the standardized mortality rates that really stood out. 2 stars means that it has a p-value less than 0.01, and 1 star means that it has a p-value less than 0.05. So these are all very important values. And sorry, I didn't even jump into what this study is, but it was actually conducted by Italian researchers in 2019, exploring the relationship between cumulative asbestos exposure and mortality from asbestos-related diseases in a large Italian pool of 21 cohorts of asbestos cement workers with protracted exposure to both crystotile and amphibole asbestos. And so the cohort actually included a total of 13,000 workers, with 81.9% being men and 18.1% being women. And all of these workers were observed for over 40 years. And so, as you can see, mortality was significantly increased for all causes and all malignant neoplasm in both genders. And so this is really important considering asbestos-related diseases were statistically significant for both men and women. When we talk about regulations, Canada was just way behind. And this probably was due to the fact that their economy was somewhat partially relying on asbestos, but countries started banning asbestos by the mid-1970s with these partial bans starting with Denmark in 1972. And then even later in the next decade, Denmark and other high-income countries began instituting full bans on asbestos as more literature came out on the harm of these materials. And so as of 2013, 67 countries had instituted either partial or complete bans on asbestos. And while the asbestos mines in Canada closed in 2011, which is much, much later than these initial bans were put in place, Canada actually didn't ban asbestos until 2018. Until 2018. And that was announced in 2016, but they gave 2 years for asbestos ban to be enacted. So I think the important question to ask is, why did Canada let this continue? Or how did not only the production of asbestos, but the use of asbestos remain a part of Canada's culture? And so this is a funny cartoon that depicts the issue, but really what happens is that the asbestos companies were paying scientists to help conduct research that would support the use of asbestos. And so an example, or the most famous example in this case, is David Bernstein, who was a toxicology consultant based in Geneva and served on the expert panel appointed by Health Canada to assess the relative carcinogenicity of chrysotile asbestos. And so he, just to break this down a little bit, he was appointed by the Canadian government to do this. And then what happens is that we find out later that Bernstein was paid by the Quigley Company, as well as by Canadian and California asbestos mining companies, and as well as by the Canadian government and the Asbestos Institute, in order to produce some sort of science that would support the value of asbestos. Or really, it was to support the theory that this special asbestos, the chrysotile asbestos, was not as harmful as the other asbestos that had been banned around the world. And so Bernstein actually testified that unlike amphibial asbestos, the shorter chrysotile fibers are removed from the lung and they are not available to cause disease. And that's a quote. He quoted that these asbestos wouldn't cause diseases, and this created a climate of intimidation. And really, what had happened is that the asbestos companies had manufactured and bought evidence to support their argument. And so immediately after this, no groups advocating for victims of asbestos or campaigning for its ban challenged the industry. This was in the early 2000s, but this would soon become more of an issue as more activist groups joined together. So we learned that countries started to ban asbestos. And so what we have here are two charts that showed where Canada and where many of the major asbestos companies were distributing and selling their asbestos to. And so as you can see here on the left in figure 4, Canada was one of the top producers in the world. But then when we look at the figure on the right, figure 5, and consumption of asbestos, Central and North America is actually not a top consumer. In fact, they consume less than 2%. And you see this huge chunk of Asia and the Middle East, and that's really where Canada was primarily sending its asbestos to. And specifically, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, Sri Lanka really worked with Quebec as well as the Asbestos Institute, to create a great trade. So, what was really interesting is, because Canada has such a good international reputation and is seen as a scientifically and democratically advanced country of sorts, Canada's image was not really tarnished during this time, and it was actually of value to the global asbestos trade, and kind of kept this under the wraps, to say. And so many Asian countries that have poor, non-existent asbestos regulations in workplaces, or those that exist that are poorly enforced, suffered and were sold these asbestos. So finally, there was a campaign that was launched to mobilize the scientific community to speak out about the deleterious effects of asbestos. And so really what the main argument came down to was, or what the fear was amongst Canadians and other asbestos miners, was the economic impact on Canada that closing these mines would have. And so while following the closures of mines, total employment in each region where the mines were located dropped from 156,000 people to 147,000 people, as well as in another region from 226,000 people employed to about 219 people employed. And similar declines in employment did not occur in the rest of Quebec within the 2 years after closing the mines. And the employment levels in both regions where they did decline actually returned to the pre-closure levels very shortly. And so the chart here is from a research study conducted in 2018, where researchers compared changes in GDP following the enactment of asbestos bans. Not only did they not find any significant on GDP following an asbestos ban on a country or regional level, but notably, any small decline at the local level was very soon reversed. And so the important takeaway is that countries should not be scared to shift away from asbestos due to economic reasons, seeing as the researchers did not find an observable negative economic impact following the institution of bans using country-level data. But unfortunately today, there are still some countries producing large amounts of asbestos and finding buyers. And so while the international market for asbestos is shrinking, there are still some players in the industry. And in 2013, Russia, Kazakhstan, and Brazil were the largest asbestos importers. So while we are making great strides, there are still some major producers who are mostly selling to vulnerable and unregulated lower middle income countries that are suffering from this market. And so to summarize, some of the key takeaways is that asbestos exportation, which took place at the Thetford mines, were very important to Canada's economy at the turn of the 21st century, and even a little bit before that. And although the health risks of asbestos became well known around the globe, Canada actually invested in resources to help maintain the vitality of its business. So they changed the name to Chrysotile. They created and funded Crystalline Institution to conduct research and create safe guidelines. And they sold to lower middle income countries that were still willing to buy and lacked regulations. And so while the mines closed, and asbestos production and usage was banned in Canada in 2016, this was not implemented until 2018. And while Canada feared the economic implications, eliminating asbestos did not significantly impact the country's GDP for any country analyzed. And these are my references, and thank you all so much.